Hi, it's September 21st, 2025. Dwyer of gamblersadvisory.com, a free site. Also, always 1776.com, a free site. Remember, the opinion you should follow should be your own. Just consider this video to be a second opinion from a complete stranger online. Now, folks, it was Dr. King who talked about how when the status quo started doing unfair things, private citizens needed to speak out to get things back in line, to address and hopefully remove the injustice. Folks, I don't like this idea of the United States of America getting involved in a sovereign fund. Right? We have our own constitution. We're different than other countries. Our constitution allows private business to regulate themselves in large part, right? To make their own profit-minded decisions, right? The government doesn't own the means of production in the United States. Entrepreneurs, investors of publicly traded companies, private investors do. They should be the ones making business decisions. Let's not distort capital markets by having the government own parts of the players, have stock in private enterprise, and then have an incentive to favor the companies that they have stock in. Right? This would be akin to a sports league, let's say the NFL, owning equity in one of the teams and then setting up a rule structure to favor that team and interpreting the rules to favor that team because they have an ownership interest in that team. Right, folks? That would wreck the entire league. That would distort capital. That would distort outcomes. Well, that's where we are right now. With our federal government, you, the taxpayer, owning shares of Intel. Right, folks? It's absurd. On the one hand, we're hearing that, certain technology is too dangerous for us to allow China to have. Isn't that the argument? Nvidia chips, right? Certain technology that Nvidia is creating can't be traded with China unless, here's the deal, Nvidia kicks back 15% to our government. Folks, either our national security is at risk or it's not. We shouldn't be cutting deals with Nvidia where for a share of the profits we allow Nvidia to trade advanced semiconductors with China, right? Isn't it Nvidia and one other company, AMD? Well, understand the risk involved. It's substantial. So now, of course, in the space, we have a share of Intel, right? Again, let me ask the question. Why should the American taxpayer have their tax dollars used to buy shares in Intel? Right? What does that say about the others in the space in which our government isn't buying shares? Why should we put ourselves on Intel's side in that sector? Well, folks, now it's snowballing. Now, of course, our business partner, the one paying us 15%, to have access to the Chinese market that, we're not giving others. Now, Nvidia has stepped in and has invested millions, in fact, billions of dollars into Intel, where we, the American taxpayer, have an equity position. In other words, now you have private actors ingratiating themselves to government. And I'm sure Nvidia also has a business reason for investing in Intel. But just understand what the setup encourages. Once our government starts owning shares of private enterprise, then other players looking for political gifts, political benefits, have an incentive to also invest in the business in which the government has an equity stake, as a way to gain influence with the government. Right? So now, Nvidia's leadership could be at a party with Donald Trump, and it's cozy. Right? We're paying you 15% for access to the Chinese market, and hey, don't forget, we've also invested billions of dollars. Look it up. Billions of dollars. Billions of our Nvidia money in a business that the government has an equity interest in. Right? So we're partners in that business. Right, folks? We need to get back to having private enterprise be private. Right? If Intel can raise money from the capital markets, if Intel's running a good enough business where on the merits Nvidia could see a profit opportunity to invest in Intel, then Intel doesn't need, in these economically fragile times, money from the American taxpayer. What are we doing with an equity interest in Intel? Please, in the comment section of this video, let's make this a public discussion. Tell us, why are we setting things up where we're investing taxpayer dollars in some business for an equity stake and giving other players in that part of the market the incentive to invest with us? Folks, from this seat, I'd rather Intel be independent of government, making its own investment decisions without the U.S. government owning an equity interest. Right? Understand the way things have been. When the government needs to buy military equipment, they buy it from defense contractors. That's the setup I like. Okay, great. Right? Let's buy from private enterprise. I don't want a setup where we own equity in one of the players. Then that distorts things, because when these government contracts come up, there's going to be a consideration of, hey, who do we own equity in? Right? I don't want to hear about how military equipment from some contractor we don't own equity in is better than what's being produced by the company that we have a financial stake in. Right? Let's award the contract to ourselves. Right? To the company that we have a stake in, regardless of what's best for the American people. Let's not set up that dynamic. Right, folks? Gold, for years now, has outperformed the S&P 500. Rather than a sovereign fund where we're buying stakes of private companies and publicly traded companies, rather than our government having a stock buying program, why don't we just invest in gold? If we want to increase our capital base, why don't we do that? What are we doing investing in Intel? Worse yet, what are we doing cutting deals with businesses like Nvidia, where we say, normally we would view you giving this high-level technology to China as endangering the health and welfare of the United States, but we'll look the other way for 15%. Right, folks? Let me say, too, there's something wrong right now where there aren't enough people opposing the president on things like this in Congress. Right? Where's the opposition? Republican or Democratic? Where are the people in Congress stepping up and saying, whoa, 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 what's the deal? For 15%, we're going to allow Nvidia to have trade with China? Right? I mean, does that 15% deal apply to everyone? Are we trying to monetize, who has access to the Chinese market? Where are the people saying, whoa, whoa, we need to put a lid on this? Today's investment, using taxpayer money, I know they've dressed it up where they say, well, under this act, we're to pay money, we just use the money for an equity stake. Understand, today, our federal government is buying shares of Intel. Tomorrow, they could be buying shares of Apple. They could be buying shares of Alphabet. Is that what we want? How would that affect regulation? Isn't that too cozy a relationship between private enterprise and our federal government? Shouldn't private enterprise, for the most part, be able to operate independently of the federal government? I don't want politicians at board meetings. Understand, too, you might love current leadership. Let's say you're one of those people who says, hey, well, Trump's doing a great job. You set a bad precedent now. You allow this administration to buy shares of Intel, right? At a time when Intel apparently is doing a good enough job to attract capital from Nvidia. What happens when this group gets voted out? Folks, Trump can't run again. This is his second term. What happens if you then get a new administration with different values? And they say, you know what? The precedent's already been set. Right? The federal government already has been investing in companies like Intel. We want to invest in a real estate developer. Right? Because, we feel that BlackRock, Blackstone, have too many homes. And we want to invest in, some private outfit that, we can own and we can give a preference to build in certain areas to preserve the integrity of this community. Right, folks, it's a slippery slope. Soon, as the people of New York City are going to find out, you're going to have the use of taxpayer money to build grocery stores, as Mamdani is planning on doing. Right? A low margin part of the economy that already is populated with, very lean operations. Amazon, Costco, others, right? Folks, that's a bad trend. We need to stop it here. The federal government isn't within $36 trillion of balancing its own books. I don't want them at Intel board meetings. Right? I want to be able to look at the public sector and say, okay, here's where the public sector starts and ends. Then I want to look at the private sector and say, okay, well, this is the private sector. I don't want my own investment decisions distorted by thoughts such as, well, in which of these companies does our federal government have an equity stake? Let's back away from that precedent. I want the United States. In fact, I want voters, because I don't trust the government. I want voters to let our government know, right? No, we don't want a sovereign fund, because I don't want government favoring companies that it has an equity interest in. That would be a move toward fascism, right? I want there to be a line of demarcation, right? We buy military weapons from defense contractors. We aren't trying to buy stock in defense contractors, right? Access to foreign markets isn't for sale. Some company, some S&P 500 company, can't show up on my doorstep and say, hey, look, man, you won't give us the right to trade with China? Would 10% close the deal? Would 15% close the deal? Right, folks? Also, think about the absurdity of it. Right? For 15%, some company now can trade high-level technology with China. If that does, in fact, increase the security risk to the United States, aren't there costs on the back end? Wouldn't we have to invest far more than the 15% in bolstering our military if this high-level technology that we're giving to China is endangering the welfare of the United States? Wouldn't the 15% cut that we're getting from Nvidia not be enough to cover the total cost of us having to ramp up our military to address that increased risk? Right, so folks, I don't like the way things are going. I haven't even gotten to the free speech concerns, where now you have, prosecutors resigning because the President of the United States isn't satisfied with the prosecutor's commitment to go after his political enemies. Right, folks, things have taken a turn for the worse. We need to right the ship now. I don't want to hear after 2028 that the precedent's already been set, where a president can, pressure prosecutors to go after his political enemies. I want judicial independence. I want private enterprise, the private sector, to remain the private sector, to not be in bed with government, where suddenly we're investing in Intel. Suddenly your tax dollars are going to buy stock in publicly traded companies. That doesn't work. So now, and again, I'm not saying Intel has nefarious intentions, but what I am saying is, here is Intel investing in, Nvidia. Here is Nvidia investing in Intel. Right? Is part of the purpose of the investment to ingratiate themselves further with government, so that the next time a 15% deal comes along, our government says, hey, it's too risky to invest in Russia. Nvidia can say, hey, man, we're investing with you in Intel. Right? We're helping buoy that stock price. Does that give us an inside track to negotiate a deal where you allow us to sell this high-level technology to Russia? Something our competitors can't do if we give you 15% of the profits. Folks, that's the kind of madness that our current status quo is opening up. We, the American voter, need to stand up and say, no, 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 we don't like this. Right? Don't use our tax dollars to buy equity positions in private sector companies. Don't cut deals with the private sector, where for the right price we'll allow them to trade high-level technology with countries we deem as our adversaries, our competitors. Folks, this has gotten out of hand. Those are my thoughts. Let me hear yours in the comments section of this YouTube video. Thanks for stopping by.